I'm Claire van der Westhuizen. In this video, we're going to be examining an important basic epidemiological concept. When we are interested in improving health at the population level, we start with defining the problem before we move on to the other steps of the public health approach. To define the problem, we need to understand and be able to use a few terms and concepts. We can define the problem by describing the prevalence or the incidence or the burden of disease. In this video, we will be discussing burden of disease. So what do we need to know about burden of disease? Well, first we need to know what it means. Then we should be able to describe some burden of disease metrics. We will discuss the metrics used by the Global Burden of Disease Study. Lastly, we will think about how burden of disease data is used and some limitations of these data. The burden of disease is the impact of a health condition on a population. The burden quantifies health loss due to a condition and allows us to compare the relative impacts of various conditions. For example, using burden of disease metrics, we can compare the health impact of asthma, schizophrenia, and road traffic injuries. There are various metrics used, but we are going to focus on the metrics used by the Global Burden of Disease Study, or GBD. The GBD study was initiated in the early 1990s when the World Bank funded the original study. The study is now continued by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington and publishes burden of disease estimates every 1 to 2 years. The GBD study is considered the largest and most comprehensive effort to quantify health loss across places and over time, so health systems can be improved and disparities eliminated. The estimates have become more and more localized as the study began with regions and countries, and estimates are now available for provinces or counties in some countries and even smaller areas. The GBD study generally accesses data collected during health surveillance activities, mortuary records, using national surveys, or other studies. They include data on non-fatal health outcomes and risk and protective factors for health, as well as mortality data. Interestingly, they are still collecting data for all years from 1990 onwards. Sometimes new data sources are discovered and added to the already huge database. And they are also still analyzing the data for all the years from 1990 onwards. Every time the GBD study publishes an update, for example, GBD 2010, GBD 2015, or GBD 2021, they rerun all the analyses for all the years from 1990. Each update is basically a whole new study on its own. So this is a definite take-home message. Only use the latest relevant GBD update, and do not compare findings across GBD updates and study papers. You may be tempted looking at 2 papers published using different GBD updates, but just don't do it. You're not comparing apples with apples. You could be comparing apples with cars, and cars don't make a good snack. Let's have a closer look at years of life lost, or YLLs, years lived with disability, or YLDs, and disability adjusted life years, or DALYs. Here we have a rough timeline and snapshot of a hypothetical person's life. The start of the timeline is their birth. We can see that they experienced poor health due to a certain health condition and an injury during their lifetime, as represented by the green blocks. In reality, we all experience many more such periods of poor health, whether it is due to a twisted ankle, a mild cold, or something more serious, such as a cancer or a chronic condition like depression or diabetes. Then we see that the grey blocks end at a certain point, and this represents the person's death. However, their age at their death is a great deal younger than the current life expectancy. The green periods in the timeline, or times when the person experienced a health condition and an injury, are times when the person was living at less than optimal health. they were living with some sort of lower functioning in these periods, even though, as we mentioned, this could be quite mild, such as having a cold, or far more serious and long-lasting. We measure these periods using the metric years lived with disability, or YLDs. As mentioned, this person died earlier than expected, and the period between the person's death and life expectancy is measured using the years of life lost metric, known as YLLs. As you can see, we have a metric of morbidity or poor health and a mortality metric. To assess the burden of disease, we take both these metrics, YLDs and YLLs, into account. They combine to give us disability-adjusted life years, or DALYs. When it comes to YLDs, one of my first questions was, how does the GBD study calculate the health loss in terms of function, or disability as GBD calls it, that is associated with each condition? Well, it's a bit of a process. Certain weights are applied to each disease, condition, injury, or state, using a number on a scale from 0 to 1, reflecting the severity of health loss associated with a health state. 0 is perfect health, and 1 is no health, which is equivalent to death. Let's pause here briefly and consider how concepts such as prevalence and burden of disease are related. We can go back to our depiction of a life with times of poor health. A condition such as a common cold will happen multiple times over a person's life, will cause minimal loss of functioning, and will be over pretty quickly. And this happens across many lives. Many people experience this because the common cold is very prevalent. But despite being highly prevalent, it is very far down the list of years lived with disability. Remember the weighting we just spoke about. What about when we look at the common cold compared to schizophrenia? The prevalence of schizophrenia is far lower than the common cold. There are many, many more people affected by cold viruses, but the common cold causes minimal, short-lived loss of function, while schizophrenia is a chronic condition with a much greater loss of function. Schizophrenia is substantially higher than the common cold on the list of YLDs. These burden of disease metrics currently inform advocacy efforts, healthcare prioritization and planning, assessment of progress made towards various public health and development goals, as well as research funding priorities. These are some pretty powerful data. So it's very important to keep the critiques of burden of disease metrics in mind as we interpret and use these data. The scale of the study is absolutely huge, and along the way, all sorts of methodological decisions need to be made. A study protocol would document these decisions to allow study reproducibility, but other investigators faced with the same methodological questions may have made slightly different decisions, which would obviously affect the findings. The study doesn't have access to all the available data, and in some cases there just isn't data available. The study has to estimate a finding somehow. If there is no finding for a health condition for a certain country, we might erroneously decide that the condition is not a problem in this country. For example, if a country reported no deaths due to suicide over a number of years, you may think there's no need to implement suicide prevention programs. But actually, in that country, suicide may be considered a crime and is vastly underreported, and the available data is just not released. In these situations, the GBD study would provide estimates based on locations that are quite similar to highlight that suicide is not absent. There are also some impacts that are not considered. For example, the GBD study does not include caregiver burden of those caring for people with health conditions. This has added health and economic implications for families. Also, not all conditions and risk factors are included, although more conditions and factors are added periodically. Although the GBD study has a long list of collaborators, the team does not always possess all the local knowledge needed to interpret local data and make decisions how to make some of these estimations where the data is limited or absent. Now for some fun. You can navigate to this website to help you create great GBD images for protocols, papers, reports, dissertations. The dataset used is the data used for the most recent update of the study. Here you can compare across years because the data all comes from the most recent version or database of the study. The visualizations are provided by the IHME team, and you can select the information you want to be included. Just be aware that the website does require good bandwidth to use. I hope this information on the burden of disease has not been too burdensome, but rather enlightening.